The wind came down from the peaks with the smell of ice and stone, sweeping across the high plateau where the town of Pucarilla clung to existence like lichen on granite. It was a place where men measured wealth in sheep and potatoes, where winter could kill as easily as hunger, and where Maria Quispe had buried her husband 3 months before, in ground so hard the gravediggers had to use pickaxes. She stood now in the office of Don Esteban Maldonado, the largest landowner in the region, a man whose family had held title to half the valley since colonial times. The office smelled of tobacco and old paper. Through the window, she could see the plaza where vendors sold wool and dried meat under a sky the color of slate. "You understand what you're buying, Senora?" Don Esteban said, not looking up from the deed. He was a heavy man with silver hair and hands that had never held a shovel. "The cabin has been abandoned for 40 years. No water nearby, no road, the roof is falling in." "I understand," Maria said. Her voice was quiet but steady. She wore a black shawl over a faded dress, and her hands were rough from washing other people's clothes in the river. She was 37 years old and looked 50. Don Esteban's lawyer, a thin man named Vargas, cleared his throat. "The property is being sold because the previous owner died without heirs. The price is 2,000 sols. You have this amount." Maria reached into the cloth bag she carried and withdrew a bundle wrapped in newspaper. Inside were bills she had saved over 15 years, money from laundry, from selling eggs, from the small inheritance her husband had left. She counted it out on the desk slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. Don Esteban watched with an expression somewhere between amusement and contempt. "You could buy a decent house in town for this, a place with walls that don't leak." "I want the cabin," Maria said. "Why?" Vargas asked. "What possible use could you have for it?" She met his eyes. "That's my business." The lawyer shrugged and began filling out the paperwork. Don Esteban leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You know the stories about that place, I assume, about why it was abandoned." "I've heard them." "And you're not afraid?" "No." The stories were simple enough. The cabin had belonged to an old geologist named Werner Hoffmann, a German who had come to Peru in the 1930s looking for minerals. He had lived alone up there for years, walking the mountains with his instruments, filling notebooks with observations. Then one winter he had simply disappeared. Some said he had fallen into a crevasse. Others claimed he had gone mad and walked into the snow to die. The cabin had remained empty ever since, slowly collapsing under the weight of altitude and neglect. Maria signed the deed with a borrowed pen. Her signature was careful and precise. The letters formed as she had been taught by missionaries decades before. When it was done, Vargas handed her a copy, and Don Esteban stood, signaling the meeting was over. "Good luck, Senora," he said, but his tone suggested he thought she would need more than luck. She walked out into the cold afternoon with the deed folded in her bag. The plaza was nearly empty now, the vendors packing up their goods as clouds rolled in from the west. She could feel people watching her, whispering. By tomorrow, everyone in Pucarilla would know that the widow Quispe had bought the haunted cabin in the mountains. "Let them talk," she thought. "Let them think I'm a fool." She had her reasons. That night, in the small room she rented behind the church, Maria sat at a table with a kerosene lamp and spread out the documents. Besides the deed, there was a crude map showing the cabin's location, 3 hours' walk from town, up a trail that switchbacked through rocky pastures and stands of eucalyptus. She studied it until she had memorized every mark, every notation. Then she took out something else, a letter her husband had given her 2 weeks before he died. He had been a careful man, a mason who could read and write, and he had spent his last conscious hours writing this. The paper was thin, the ink fading, but the words were clear. "Maria," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone. I never told you everything because I feared it would bring danger. But now you must know. The German, Hoffmann, he was not a madman. He found something in those mountains, something the government wanted to hide. I helped him once, long ago, before we were married. He showed me his notebooks. He showed me where he kept them. If you are brave enough, go to the cabin. Look behind the false wall in the chimney. What you find there could change everything, but be careful. There are men who would kill to keep this secret buried. Trust no one." Her husband's signature was shaky, written by a hand already losing strength. Maria folded the letter and placed it back in her bag. She had read it 100 times, weighing every word, trying to understand what her husband had meant. A false wall in the chimney, notebooks, a secret worth killing for. Tomorrow, she would find out. Chapter 2. The Discovery. Maria left before dawn, when the stars were still sharp overhead, and the only sound was the barking of dogs in distant compounds. She wore thick wool stockings, a heavy skirt, and a poncho that had belonged to her husband. On her back was a canvas pack containing food, water, a flashlight and tools, a small crowbar, a hammer, matches. The trail was steep and loose with scree. She climbed slowly, stopping often to catch her breath in the thin air. By the time the sun rose, she was already above the tree line, moving through a landscape of brown grass and grey stone. To her left, the valley dropped away in layers of shadow. To her right, the mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky. She reached the cabin just before noon. It was smaller than she had imagined, built of stone with a corrugated metal roof that had rusted through in several places. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. The windows were empty rectangles, through which the wind passed freely. Around it, the ground was littered with debris, broken pottery, rotted timbers, shards of glass caught in tufts of yellow grass. Maria pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim and cold. Dust covered everything. The floor was packed earth, and in one corner was a stone fireplace with a chimney built from river rock. Against the walls were the remnants of furniture. A collapsed bed frame, a table with 3 legs, shelves that had pulled free from their brackets. She set down her pack and lit the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing seemed unusual at first, just the ruins of a solitary life, abandoned and forgotten. But then she approached the fireplace. The chimney was wide at the base, narrowing as it rose. The stones were mortared together with clay that had cracked over the years. She knelt and examined them closely, running her fingers along the joints. On the left side, about waist-high, she found what she was looking for, a section where the mortar was different, smoother, newer. Maria took out the crowbar and began to pry at the stones. They resisted at first, but then one shifted, then another. She worked carefully, removing them one by one and setting them aside. Behind the stones was a cavity, a space hollowed out of the chimney's interior. And in that space was a metal box, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with wire. Her heart was hammering now. She pulled the box free and carried it to the window where the light was better. The oilcloth was brittle with age and tore easily. Beneath it was a steel case, still solid, with a simple latch. She opened it. Inside were notebooks, 6 of them, bound in leather, filled with cramped handwriting in German and Spanish, maps, diagrams, photographs of rock formations and mineral samples, and underneath everything, a thick folder containing official documents, letters, surveys, geological reports, stamped with government seals. Maria sat down on the floor and began to read. Werner Hoffmann had been thorough. The notebooks detailed years of exploration, hundreds of miles walked, thousands of samples analyzed. He had been searching for something specific, rare earth elements, the minerals that the modern world needed for electronics, batteries, advanced manufacturing, and he had found them. Not in small deposits, but in vast concentrations running through an entire mountain range north of Pucarilla. The numbers were staggering. According to Hoffmann's calculations, the deposits contained enough lithium, cobalt, and copper to supply industries for generations. The value was incalculable, and the implications were clear. Whoever controlled this resource could transform Peru's economy, could lift entire regions out of poverty. But that wasn't all Maria found. The documents told another story. In 1942, Hoffmann had reported his discovery to the Ministry of Mining. He had submitted formal claims, had followed every legal procedure. But instead of being rewarded, he had been silenced. The ministry had seized his research, had declared the area off-limits, had threatened him with imprisonment if he spoke publicly about what he had found. Why? The answer was in a letter from a ministry official to a private mining company based in Lima. The government had secretly sold the exploration rights to this company, a consortium controlled by wealthy families, including the Maldonados. They had intended to keep the discovery quiet until they could secure foreign investment and develop the mines themselves, cutting out local communities entirely. Hoffman had refused to cooperate. He had hidden his research and disappeared into the mountains, intending to eventually expose the truth. But he had never gotten the chance. Maria read until the light began to fail. Then she carefully repacked the box, wrapped it in her poncho and secured it in her pack. She looked around the cabin one last time, at the dust and the shadows and the ruins of a life spent pursuing truth. Then she began the long walk back to town. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. The rumors started within days. Maria had been seen returning from the mountains with a heavy pack. She had been asking questions at the municipal office about mineral rights and land surveys. She had visited the library in the provincial capital, requesting old government reports. Don Esteban heard the rumors and sent for her. She arrived at his estate on a Saturday morning, passing through gates of wrought iron into a courtyard where roses grew in imported soil. A servant led her to a sitting room filled with furniture from Europe and paintings of ancestors who had never worked a day in their lives. Don Esteban was there, along with his son Ricardo and two other men she didn't recognize. One was introduced as an attorney from Lima. The other wasn't introduced at all, but she could tell from his bearing that he was accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. "Señora Quispe," Don Esteban began, his voice cordial but cold. "We've heard you've been quite busy since purchasing that cabin. May I ask what you've found up there?" "Nothing that concerns you," Maria said. Ricardo, a man in his 30s with his father's arrogance but none of his restraint, laughed. "Everything in these mountains concerns us. My family has been here for 300 years. Then perhaps you should know what your family has been hiding," Maria said. The room went silent. Don Esteban's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or fear. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," he said carefully. "But I would caution you against making accusations you cannot support." Maria reached into her bag and withdrew one of Hoffman's notebooks. She opened it to a page filled with maps and geological data. Werner Hoffman found mineral deposits worth billions. He reported them to the government in 1942, and your family made sure that discovery was buried so you could profit from it privately. "That's a lie," Ricardo said, standing up. "It's documented," Maria said, her voice steady. "Hoffman kept records, letters, surveys, proof that the Ministry of Mining sold exploration rights to a company your family controls, proof that you've been sitting on this resource for decades while people in this region starve." The attorney from Lima spoke for the first time. "Even if such documents exist, they would be irrelevant now. The original claims have expired. Any resources in those mountains are subject to current law and current ownership, which means they belong to Peru," Maria said. "To the people, not to you." Don Esteban stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice was measured, almost gentle. "You're a poor woman, Señora. You have no education, no influence, no powerful friends. Even if you went to the authorities with this material, who do you think they would believe? Who do you think they would protect?" "Maybe they would protect the truth," Maria said. "The truth is what we make it," the unnamed man said. He had a voice like gravel, and when Maria looked at him, she saw something in his face that made her blood go cold. "You should consider your position carefully. Señora, widows can have accidents, especially widows who wander alone in the mountains." Maria stood. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her voice level. "If anything happens to me, these documents will be made public. I've made arrangements." It was a bluff, but she delivered it with enough conviction that she saw doubt cross Don Esteban's face. "Get out," Ricardo said. "Get out before we have you arrested for trespassing." Maria walked out of the estate and didn't look back. Her legs felt weak and she could taste copper in her mouth, but she had said what needed to be said. She had shown them that she knew. Now came the hard part, proving it to the world. Chapter 4. The Revelation. Maria spent the next 2 weeks preparing. She made copies of the most important documents, hiding them in different locations. One with the priest, one with her sister in the next town, one buried beneath a stone marker in the cemetery, She contacted a journalist in Lima, a woman who had written about mining corruption before. And she reached out to a geology professor at the university who had published research on rare earth elements. The response was cautious but interested. The journalist wanted to see the documents. The professor wanted to verify Hoffman's data. Maria arranged for them to come to Pucarilla. Don Esteban learned of the plan and tried to stop it. He sent men to intimidate the journalist, to pressure the professor. He went to the mayor and demanded that Maria be evicted from town. He even filed a legal complaint claiming the documents were stolen property. But it was too late. The story was already moving beyond his control. On a Wednesday morning, Maria led a group to the mountains. The journalist, the professor, 2 graduate students and a representative from the Regional Mining Bureau. They climbed the trail to the cabin, and from there, following Hoffman's maps, they hiked another hour to the site of the main deposits. The professor took samples. He used portable equipment to analyze the mineral content, and when he was finished, he turned to the group with an expression of amazement. "Hoffman was right," he said. "These deposits are extraordinary, perhaps the richest concentration of lithium and rare earths in South America. The economic value is, it's difficult to even estimate." The journalist was already writing, her fingers flying across her phone's keyboard. "This is going to be national news, international news." The Mining Bureau representative was less enthusiastic. "There will need to be a full investigation, environmental studies, community consultation. This can't be developed without proper oversight." "That's exactly the point," Maria said. "This should benefit everyone, not just one family." The story broke 3 days later. It appeared first in a Lima newspaper, then was picked up by wire services, television networks, international media. The headline was simple: "Widow uncovers 80-year cover-up of billion-dollar mineral deposits." The article detailed everything: Hoffman's discovery, the government's suppression, the Maldonado family's secret dealings, Maria's courage in bringing the truth to light. It included photographs of the documents, interviews with the professor, statements from mining experts confirming the deposit's value. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted in Pucarilla and surrounding towns. People demanded accountability. Opposition politicians called for investigations. The Ministry of Mining was forced to open formal proceedings. Don Esteban's empire began to crumble. His business partners distanced themselves. His political allies abandoned him. Prosecutors started looking into his family's financial records, uncovering decades of corruption and fraud. Maria watched it all from a distance. Still living in her small room behind the church, she gave interviews, testified before government committees, met with community leaders about how the resources should be managed. She never asked for recognition or reward. She simply wanted to ensure that what had been hidden was now visible, that what had been stolen could be reclaimed. 6 months after her discovery, the government announced a new development plan. The mineral deposits would be extracted under strict environmental controls, with profits shared between the national treasury and local communities. A percentage would be set aside for education, infrastructure and healthcare in the region. It wasn't perfect. There would be challenges, delays, corruption to fight, but it was a beginning. Maria stood in the plaza one evening as the sun set behind the mountains. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of eucalyptus smoke from cooking fires. Around her, people were going about their evening routines, closing shops, herding animals, gathering children. She thought about her husband, about the letter he had left her, about the courage it must have taken for him to trust her with such a burden. She thought about Hoffman, alone in his cabin, refusing to be silenced even when silence might have saved him. And she thought about all the other secrets still buried in these mountains, truths waiting to be uncovered by ordinary people with extraordinary persistence. A young girl approached her, one of the children from the neighborhood. "Señora Maria," she said shyly, "my mother says you're a hero." Maria smiled and touched the girl's hair. "No, child, I'm just someone who refused to look away." The girl ran off, and Maria turned toward home. The stars were beginning to appear, sharp and cold in the thin mountain air. Tomorrow there would be more meetings, more work to do. But tonight she would rest. She had done what needed to be done. She had turned worthlessness into value, silence into testimony, darkness into light. And that, she thought, was enough.